Hi, welcome to Ms. Richardson's U.S. History 5-Minute Lectures. This information is U.S. Notes 5.17, Election of 1968. It includes information that goes along with the second section on your study guide. Make sure you're using your study guide to help you take the notes, to figure out what's important, and write down any questions you have so that we can fill those in at class. Let's go ahead and get started. In the last set of notes, you learned about how feelings regarding the Vietnam War shifted as the war progressed. This resulted in changes in leadership in 1968, which is what I'm going to tell you about today. As the war progressed, it became more clear that a small investment would not gain the U.S. victory in Vietnam, which is what President Johnson had believed. So Johnson, who had escalated the war early on, realized he had to change tactics. He had no real choice. On May 10, 1968, President Johnson began peace talks in Paris with the North Vietnamese leaders. He was willing to end the war with a tolerable peace agreement, so he wanted something that both sides could live with. But, dun dun dun, there was a presidential election in 1968, and it would end up impacting these talks. The North Vietnamese knew that Johnson would have to run for re-election in November in order to ensure the peace agreements had to happen. So for those to happen, he still needed to be president or have a good relationship with the new president. And Johnson was really unpopular during this point in his presidency. He had started his years in office after JFK was assassinated, and he had extremely high support with that. And it had dropped significantly over the years. In 1968, although he was permitted to run for a second full term, he chose not to run for president. He was so unpopular, he knew that he would lose. This meant the field was wide open for those who wished to take on the challenge of Vietnam as president. Humphrey rose as the Democratic frontrunner when Johnson stepped aside. Nixon ran against him as the Republican challenger. And in a twist here, there was a third-party candidate, Wallace, who ran as an independent and was very popular in the South. Americans were torn on who and what to support. While Republicans are traditionally in favor of wars, the Democratic President Johnson had escalated this particular one. Many Democrats questioned this policy, and they felt it ran very contrary to their party beliefs. This meant that many Democrats wanted the party to add an anti-war platform to the party platform in 1968. The party did not do this, which led to protests and riots at the National Convention. So in 1968, the Democratic National Convention was held in Chicago, Illinois. In addition to protesters who opposed the U.S. policy in Vietnam, protesters who wanted the anti-war platform added to the Democrats' platform filled the city. Riot police were called in to stop the protests and keep them under control. Peaceful protests, what had been planned as peaceful protests, turned into riots. Police and protesters clashed for 8 days while the convention was held. 152 police were reported wounded, with around 600 others wounded. Now, some of these wounds that were reported were really minor, like cuts and scrapes, but others did require hospitalization. With all the unrest, you can guess that in the general election, the Democrats failed to come out victorious. With a split vote and the split party of the Democrats, Richard Nixon won the 1968 election to become the next U.S. president. Number 37, Richard Nixon. Now the Vietnam War was his issue to fix. So is it really winning when you have to deal with that? We'll look at that in our next set of notes because this is the end of 5.17. I'll see you in class with any questions you have.